open it up for questions. Please wait for the wireless microphones on each side and just state your name and affiliation before you ask the question. And with that, we'll hand it over to Derek Falvey.
Thank you, Dustin. As he just mentioned, we're here today certainly to follow up on the announcement that we've made a change at the manager position for the Minnesota Twins. We had a chance this morning to talk with Paul Molitor briefly about a conversation about the future of our manager position and our franchise. And I can tell you that first and foremost, I want to thank Paul on so many levels around what he's meant to me over the last 2 years, but certainly what he's meant in that position as manager with the Twins over the last 4. When I got a chance to speak with Paul this morning, I can tell you that one of the most difficult conversations, certainly of my career and maybe of my life, around talking about what was best for the future of the Minnesota Twins. And not surprisingly, even a bit, Paul Molitor and his graciousness and his general understanding and appreciation and respect. Paul is so much more about what's on the front of the jersey here than the back, and I think that speaks to who he is truly as a person and what he means to this franchise. We talked a bit about a transition, an opportunity to continue here with the Minnesota Twins, something that harkens back a bit to a conversation we had even going back a year ago, knowing that the future of managing here for Paul, I think, as Paul would have said himself, not managing forever, but certainly understanding how much he wants to be a part of this organization moving forward. We discussed that, and I will say I am hopeful and we feel had some good conversations around what that looks like moving forward. But today, certainly difficult decision, a complex decision, but something we feel is in the best long-term interests of this club right now. At this moment in time, we felt this was the move for this baseball team, both in the shorter term here and then as we build toward the long-term future. So
that will open it up for questions. Charlie in the front.
Yeah, Charlie Walter, St. Paul Pioneer Press. Derek, do you have somebody in mind right now?
We're going to work through a process, certainly an exhaustive one, and going through who we will seek to find as the next manager of the Minnesota Twins. I will say this, that we focused really all of our energies and efforts over the last couple of days to think through how we wanted to work through this with Paul. And at this stage, certainly we'll work through a candidate list and begin our search in earnest now, but there is no one candidate at this point. I would think in terms of time frame, certainly there are a number of other teams that are seeking managers right now. There'll be a process that we need to get started immediately to catch up to some of those clubs. And at the same time, we won't put a specific time frame on it. We want to find the right person for the Twins for the long term. But I would imagine it will take multiple weeks.
Jim.
What was complex about the decision, and what led you to the decision?
Sure. What's complex about it on a number of levels is certainly Paul and who Paul is and what he means to this franchise and how much he cares every day when he walks through those clubhouse doors and how much he impacts this team. That's never lost on me. And it wasn't in that moment, and I think our conversation this morning reflected that. What was complex about it was a lot has transpired over the last 12 months with our club and where we are. And we are not where we need to be right now. And we know we need to take different steps moving forward. And some of that's going to be with an eye toward the development of the foundation for a long-term future. And I think Paul generally understands that's part of this. We need to continue to evolve and grow and develop. But at this stage, I feel like this was the right long-term decision, despite some of the short-term difficulty.
Joe Schmidt, 5 Eyewitness News. How do you relay to the fans that Paul's not the scapegoat for guys who had a bad season, trades and acquisitions you guys made in the offseason that did not turn out for the team this year?
Sure. I would say a lot of factors go into these decisions every time, and Paul knows that, and Paul knows that we've talked all along about his openness and willingness to engage with us on a number of different topics. When we made this decision, I can tell you this wasn't just about wins and losses. Right now at this moment, it was about where our club is for the present and the future. And I've said that to Paul this morning. I'll say it again. This wasn't about our record this year. This is about what we think is best as we continue to grow a young team in the direction toward being a championship contender.
Jim.
Derek, Jim Rich, Fox 9. A year ago, you handed Paul a 3-year contract and said he was part of the future,
Sure.
part of the solution. What changed? Because had they not gotten into the wild card, would you have made this move a year ago?
That's a fair question, and I think that's something Paul and Thad and I all discussed this morning, was what has transpired over the last 12 months. We went into this season with a certain expectation around continued growth and development off of last year. Certainly, we took a step backward, as a team collectively this year. And as we thought about where we are now and moving into next year and the years beyond, we believe we're in a slightly different spot around continuing to grow these young players and thinking about what the long-term timeline looks like. Now, I will say, in conversation with Paul last year at that time, we did talk about what the future could look like if he wasn't managing, and it's never the right time to make a difficult decision, and it's never easy. You have to weigh all the factors that we learned about this team this year, where we are, what we need to do moving forward, and we felt like now was the time to have that conversation with Paul.
Lavelle.
Lavelle Neal, Minneapolis Star-Tribune. Derek, was there something with the culture in the clubhouse that you feel needed to head in a different direction? And can you talk about some of the qualities in a manager that you're looking for, and the important qualities?
If you don't mind, I'll take a crack at it. So, Lavelle, I think you're always evaluating leadership qualities, but it's not rest solely on a manager. You look to the coaching staff, you look to the players in the clubhouse. I think a year ago this time, when we were tracking towards the playoffs, I think people spoke very glowingly about the culture in the clubhouse. So I think it's a totally evolutionary process. It has a lot to do with the chemistry within that group. I think we've talked openly to this group before about the fact that, with some of the moves we made this offseason, we had a lot of guys in the clubhouse who all were on expiring deals, and that may have had an impact. So I think we are looking ourselves in the mirror as much as anything as to the impact that we've had on the chemistry of the clubhouse and the environment they're in. It is something we take very seriously. It's something that we believe in. When you're in a championship culture, you're going to see strength through your coaching staff and your clubhouse and the players and the leadership therein.
Mike Max from WCCO. Does it have to do with just one-on-one, him working with young players? Or, do you see that as a weakness or something because you're going to be young going forward? And is that part of this assessment?
No, sorry, go ahead. I just think that's a challenge. For any team, there's always a challenging dynamic with young players, veteran players, guys in between. We just feel like, from the standpoint of this team moving forward, a change in voice and potential style with some of those younger players could be of benefit to us. Now, that's not to say there's any one thing or one reason or one interaction Paul has had. I think he's great with a lot of our young players and conversations with them. This just felt like the right time to make a transition with those young players for the long-term future.
I think Paul has tremendous relationships with our young players in terms of respect across the board, without question. We've gotten a lot of calls from some of those players today to talk in support of him. But I think today's player is maybe increasingly demanding on coaches and managers relative to relationships and motivation and those sorts of things. So we need to continue to try to put the resources around them that can service them in this new generation of player.
We'll go Dan in the back.
Dan Hayes, The Athletic. This week, Paul had indicated he was thinking he was coming back next season. What level of surprise maybe was there on his end when you guys informed him?
I think when we sat with Paul this morning, I don't know that necessarily he had said, even when you get this job or when you get any of these jobs, there's always the potential on the back end of change. And I think that Paul certainly this morning said he had kind of always prepared himself, maybe even when we first were hired, that was something that could happen along the way. So you're never necessarily expecting it, or certainly disappointment, but a true, to Paul's credit and who Paul is, a true understanding of the rationale for why we thought this was the right time. Whether or not he agreed with it, that was up to him, but I think he certainly could understand why in the moment we felt this was the right time.
Derek.
Thad, when Derek was hired, he mentioned that he has a short list sort of in his head at all times for these jobs. Do you have a similar short list? And if not, what kind of qualities are you going to look for in the next manager?
So with regards to lists, I think one thing that we've been consistent with ever since we've gotten these opportunities is that anytime there's a new leadership position, we've been very thoughtful. Point of fact, Derek hasn't brought a single person over from Cleveland, nor have I from the Texas Rangers. In reality, the lion's share of the people who we've brought into this organization were people we didn't have a previous relationship with. I think we're planning on approaching this post in the same regard, where we're hopeful we can be as thorough as we can and get the absolute best candidates to walk through this door, ultimately the best of whom would win this job. But not, Charlie asked the question earlier, this would be a very quick process if we really had a specific person in mind. We do not. We do have some qualities in mind. I think we would prefer to share those as time goes on, because as Derek mentioned, we've been so focused on making sure we manage this part of the process appropriately that we maybe haven't quite verbalized those as succinctly as we'd like. But the point is, we're going to look through all sorts of resources, tap into as many people as we can to put together the best list we possibly can, vet them to the best of our ability, and then ultimately hire the right person.
Eric in the back.
Yeah, Eric Perkins, Care 11, Derek or Thad, I guess. With that said, how much does analytics and the ability to embrace that moving forward play into this role?
That's always going to be a part of any decision we make, and we've talked openly about use of information and data and otherwise as part of what we do across baseball operations. I will say this to follow that up, though. I think Paul in particular was incredibly open-minded to different things that were brought along the way, and I want to make it clear that that's not something that was something we were concerned about with Paul along the way. But we have new information every day. There's new data coming in, whether it's TrackMan or StatCast or everything else that gets talked about every night. We all need to find ways to adapt and use that to the best of our abilities in making this team the best that it can be. So I think a manager, whoever the manager comes in, certainly there are leadership qualities and key abilities in that role, but understanding and how to use information will be a big part of that too.
Go back to Lavelle here.
I'm going to dovetail off that last question and ask you the flow of data from your research and development department, the Jeremy Hefner, to pick through Molitor, coaching staff to players. Were you satisfied with that, the flow of information and how it was being presented to your players?
I think you have to appreciate how much change we've implemented in the 2 years we've been here. And against the backdrop of trying to win night in and night out, it puts a lot of pressure on the people who are ultimately making those decisions. But I can't say enough positive about how much Paul assimilated a lot of that information into ultimately his decisions that he made pre-game and during game and kind of in the post-mortem after games. But we're aware that there's an ability we have to try to put people in better positions to succeed moving forward. Kind of the newness of that implementation of some of those new resources, new information, shouldn't be there anymore. We should be able to address those responsibly moving forward. I think we play a role in setting that up appropriately, but I think when we find the right partner at the helm, that will go a long way as well.
Joe on the left.
I was just going to see, among the things you guys are looking for with your clubhouse and the number of Spanish speakers, how important or potentially important could a bilingual speaker be?
Well, it's certainly a quality that we talk about on our staff, making sure that we have, as you mentioned, a number of players from Latin America, and the ability to communicate with them and connect with them is important. I think you want to think about that across the board on your staff and how it impacts individual players. Certainly a manager who has some Spanish-speaking ability helps, most likely, because they can connect directly as well. But I don't think that's a singular quality that necessarily needs to be there. We just need to make sure it's a part of our process across our staff development.
Brandon Warren, Zone Coverage. What's the status of the rest of the coaching staff, and if you haven't addressed that yet, when do you plan to?
So we've spoken with our coaches, each of them, after we had that conversation with Paul, and as is typical in this case, certainly we'll work through the process individually with each person. Some are under contract, others are not, but if they were to intend to pursue specific opportunities elsewhere, we feel it would only be right to allow them to do so. So we'll handle each individual staff member on its own.
Pat?
Derek, would you be open to hiring someone who's never managed before?
Yeah, I think that certainly we look across baseball right now and we see managers of all types. Guys with more recent playing experience, those with a number of years of experience in the dugout. I would say that we're going to evaluate each candidate. We don't have one specific defined type of candidate that we need to find. There are certainly, as Thad mentioned, qualities that we're looking for, but we would be open to manager candidates with a number of different types of backgrounds.
Phil.
Derek, what kind of role do you envision for Paul should he accept it? and what impact would it have potentially on the major league team?
Sure.
And on a personal level, would it be difficult to work with him every day?
I would say, let me answer the second one first. My admiration for Paul's baseball acumen, knowledge is very strong. And so, in my opinion, I think Paul has an opportunity to impact in a lot of different areas if he so chooses. We've talked about the role in a more substantive baseball operations role, probably initially at least around some things in player development, some things he loves to do in terms of teaching young kids and players, the potential for him impacting us around just big picture decisions. I wouldn't, because of who Paul is, because of the way he's handled this, because of the respect I have for him and the way our relationship has developed over the last couple of years, I wouldn't necessarily find that to be a problem. And I think with respect to the major league environment, I think it would only be fair, certainly in the short term anyway, to maybe have some disconnect from that environment in that role. But outside of that, I feel like it would be a great opportunity for our organization to continue to have him a part of it.
We do a few more. Rhett?
Do you see next year as a year you guys can compete with the way that this year went in terms of the new manager and everything? Do you feel like you guys can compete next year?
I mean, I think every year you're trying to honestly assess your team and you want to take steps forward. And I think what we saw this year was the team ends up with 78 wins, which I think, when you started the season, it's fewer than what we had aspired to have, but quite frankly, it's not dramatically so. I think we're looking a little bit more at some of the individual performances on our team. So I think what we're aspirational of controlling is identifying that young core of players that we've talked about for years in this community and applying ourselves this offseason to try to have those guys collectively take a step forward. And I think if we do that, the wins and losses will probably take care of themselves, and the gap right now that we see between us and the Cleveland Indians will start closing pretty rapidly.
A little bit off topic, but will you offer Joe Mauer a contract to make his decision a little bit easier on what he wants to do next year?
Offer him in advance of his decision?
Well, it might make him make his decision easier.
Sure. Well, sure. Joe and I have had a number of conversations down the stretch during the course of this season. What we saw on Sunday was truly magical on so many levels. I think Joe was one of the first people actually I reached out to today and just had a chance to chat with him. And I think he's intent on taking some time and thinking about what is right for him. I would anticipate we'll have multiple conversations during the course of this offseason, whether it's in a playing capacity moving forward or the opportunity to come help us out in some way, shape, or form here with the Twins.
Two more. Dan?
Back to next year, how difficult is the years that Byron and Miguel had as far as forecasting next year? Just trying to figure out what they're capable of next year. How hard is it to assess what you guys can do next year?
Well, I think when you have all these projection systems as sophisticated as we hope they are, the 2 seasons that those guys just put together were certainly not on the spectrum of things that we expected. So I think, as I said earlier, we're going to be very focused this offseason and doing whatever we can in our power to put the best resources we possibly can around those 2 guys, as well as some of our other young players. We're aware that if these guys realize their potential in 2019 at the major league level, it's a much different conversation about our competitive landscape. We're hopeful that we can do everything we can to put them in a position to impact us in that regard.
Final question. Phil.
Derek, you said when you got here that everything would be done by consensus and you would have the final call.
Sure.
Was this a unanimous or a consensus decision? And how much did your meetings with him since the season ended impact your final decision?
Yeah, I certainly value the counsel of so many of our group of people. And I think for those who've been around and have seen how we operate, there is a lot of collaboration and conversation among the group of people. Ultimately, it was something that it's not easy. There's no easy, clear-cut decision on any of these. And I think ultimately, collectively, we felt this was the right decision moving forward. And then when I brought that recommendation to ownership, they were supportive of that recommendation. So it's not an easy decision by any means, but certainly something that we felt collectively was the best thing for our franchise.
And not made yesterday.
And not made yesterday. No, over the course, you think about these things not in a one-day period of time, certainly thinking about what was best, but over the course of the last few days, wondering whether or not this was the right time to start that conversation. It felt clearer to me that now was the time to have it.
With that concludes today's press conference. Thank you all for joining us. We'll excuse Derek and Thad at this time.
Thank you.
If anybody needs Dave St. Peter and Jim Polad, please see me at the front.